evening to my all my fellow friends, speakers, distinguished speakers, moderator, members of GCTC, and the lovely audience. I, on behalf of GCTC, like to welcome you all to one more episode of GCTC Manthan. As you all know, that India has been continuously pushing for a united global front effort against all those who support terror or help generate finances for the terrorism, as the country strongly believes that should be a zero tolerance to towards the menace. India has been continuously raising its concern over the tactic support
Like,
some nations are extending to terror groups. Money laundering and terror financing are serious crimes that threaten to establish the global economy. There is a need for a united global effort against all those who support terror or help generate finances of terrorism. Regular funding is being made available to those organizations through various illegal means. Here, Pakistan has to be blamed for sponsoring and supporting terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Hizbul Mujahideen, IS, which were responsible for hundreds of attacks in India and rest of the nations. How can we miss the 9/11 attack, 27/11 attack, and the Parliament attack in Delhi? Global Counterterrorism Council recognizes the importance of international cooperation in the fight against global menace and money laundering and financing of terrorism. To promote the agenda forward, we have gathered today on this virtual platform for a debate on global cooperation on anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism. We look forward to listen to eminent personalities over here. Today we have with us distinguished speakers. I would start with our moderator, Mr. Karnail Singh. Well, Mr. Karnail Singh needs no introduction. Well, he has been the executive member of the GCTC, and he has been the former Enforcement Directorate and Director of FIU. Warm welcome, sir. We have with us Professor Amitabh Bhattu. Well, Professor Amitabh Bhattu is the Professor of Disarmament Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has been the former Vice Chancellor and former member of National Security Advisory Board. He is also the Padam Shri awardee. Warm welcome, sir, to you. We also have with us Helen Edwards. Well, Helen Edwards, an Australian branch coordinator for GCTC, and she has been the Senate candidate for 2019 Australia, and she has been a kind of whistleblower also. So we have with us DGP Loknath Behera sir. Loknath Behera sir is a Director General of Police from Kerala. We welcome you, sir. Your experience will certainly help us in driving this move forward. Also, we would be having with us Mahavir Singhvi. He is the Joint Secretary, Counterterrorism, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. We also have with us Cleo Pascal, who is a non-resident fellow from FDD, Noble Think Tank from USA. We are also likely to have with us the Minister of State for Home Affairs, Government of India. So we are looking forward, and yes, none other than that, I would request now the moderator to please take it from here. Oh yes, also we have two interventions. One is Nikita Kohli. She is a research analyst from Midcat Services. And we have Shreesh from USA. Above all, we have Colonel S.M. Kumar. Warm welcome, Colonel. Well, Colonel S.M. Kumar is the co-founder and managing director for MidCat Services. Warm welcome you all, sir. And now I will proceed to Colonel Singh. Over to you, sir. Sorry, I've left one name, that is our own family of GCTC. He's the executive council member of GCTC and looking after the JNK chapter, Kuldeep Khuda, sir. He is a former Director General of Police from JNK and former Chief Vigilance Commissioner. Warm welcome, sir, to you, sir. Karnal Singh, sir. Sir, kindly unmute your mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aditya. I welcome the speakers and the participants. The theme of today's topic is about United Nations Security Council Resolution 1267 and 73. What are the issues related to them? What is the due process? And the role of Financial Action Task Force, and how the money laundering and the terror financing can be controlled. Briefly, I would give about what is Financial Action Task Force. See what happened in 80s in Italy and US. The mafia was very powerful. This drug mafia was not allowing even the countries to investigate against them. And it was difficult to catch them because only the foot soldiers were operating. If anybody will catch the foot soldiers. Generally, the investigation revolves around the particular case. But in this case, the investigators in Italy, they started trying to find out the money trail of the mafia. The investigator went to United States also. And there was cooperation between these two countries, which led to ultimately two important trials. One was Maxi trial in Italy and one was Pisa trial case in United States. With the success of tracing the drug money, there was a convention which is known as Vienna Convention in 1988. It has three aspects. One is that the drug people should not be able to use or utilize the money. The banking laws should be relaxed so that investigating officers could get access to the information from banks, and there should be international cooperation. To relax the banking laws for investigation purposes, Basel Committee was formed in 1989, which decided that the secrecy laws of the banks would be relaxed if there is an investigation for the drug money. Now, on the initiative of G7, one intergovernmental organization was created in 1989, which is known as FATF, Financial Action Task Force. To begin with, it has only mandate of the drug money, but there was another convention in 2000, which is known as Palermo Convention, where besides the drug money, other organized crime and transnational crimes were introduced in it. Then after 9/11, it added terror financing. It had at that time 49 recommendations, 40 for the money laundering and 9 for the terror financing. But now it has only 40 recommendations clubbing all those. In 2013, it came out with the effectiveness. Even if one country has laws, whether those laws are effective. For example, Pakistan has formulated the laws in that country, but those laws have not been implemented effectively. So how does it monitor? The FATF monitors through the process of mutual evaluation. And this report is submitted to the FATF, which is examined there. Now, it has 4 recommendations about terror financing. The recommendation 5 deals with financing. If anybody is financing a terrorist act or terrorist organization, whether source is legitimate or illegitimate, then action can be taken against them. Now, here we are talking about the targeted financing, which comes under recommendation 6 of the FATF, which talks of the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1267 and 1373. Then recommendation 7 talks of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And recommendation 8 talks of the non-profit organizations, if they can be misused by the terrorist in transferring the funds. Basically, if we see, to the topic has the 4 aspects. The one is the generation of the terror funds. Second is the United Nations Security Council resolutions. Third is its implementation. And fourth is about investigation. So we would start with first generation of the terror funding. We have one of the most expert who had dealt terrorism in Kashmir, Mr. Kuldeep Khoda IPS. I'll request him to brief us about the generation of terror funding and how it could be controlled. Mr. Kuldeep Khoda.
Thank you, Karnail Singh ji, for the introduction. And also, thank you, Aditi, for organizing this webinar. As has been brought out, the terror financing is one of the crucial issues and crucial problems which we are facing at the global level, and India is one of the main targets of terror financing. Now, coming specifically to generation of the terror funding, the funds, how they are operated, how they are generated. You know, in Kashmir, we generally found that the remittances are coming mostly from abroad, and most of the trail leads to Pakistan. Though it doesn't come directly from Pakistan, obviously to avoid any detection. The Middle East countries, Dubai, some of the European countries, particularly the Netherlands, France, Spain, UK, and USA have been found to generate money from various resources and then transfer them to their targets. Now, between the terrorists and the money launderers, the methods used by terrorists for generating money are more or less similar to the ways and means used by the money launderers for generating money for illegal activities. As Karnail Singh brought out, the mafias which were there in US and Italy, how they used to generate drug money. And I must also refer to Cuba, again in late 1980s, when the drug cartels of Cali and Medellin, they had become so powerful and huge generators of illegal money that their methods were copied by terrorists into generating funds. Now, one of the preferred methods of generating funds is the trafficking of drugs, narcotics, and psychotropic substances. And this trade has been going on since the days of mafias and on to terrorist organizations which have been generating this money, and the drugs and narcotics are cultivated in countries where the terrorists have hold on the land areas, physical hold on the land areas, and the trafficking channels mostly were used. Those channels were mostly used, which were also used by the drug mafia generators and traffickers. Now, the other means of generation of money which we found is that the NGOs which have been created all over, in whether it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, Middle East, Europe, and US particularly, the NGOs have developed a unique method of generating money, coming out with lots of charter of duties, which are mostly charity-oriented works, but used for other subversive activities also. Like I'll name Jamatul Dawa, headed by Hafiz Saeed. It is registered in an NGO as a charity organization in Pakistan. And it took United Nations decades to declare this organization as a terrorist organization. Likewise, we have the real estate, how it has been used to multiply money, and the illicit money which is derived out of real estate business gets transferred. Then the other means which is very prevalent among these terrorist gangs is the credit card frauds. The credit card frauds are so prevalent that according to an estimate of FATF, 2 to 5% of global GDP per year is generated annually from the proceeds of crime, of which credit card frauds is also one of the major resources. Now the crime is that includes the arms and people smuggling, the corruption, the fraud, extortion, kidnapping, etc. Now, of late, Afghanistan was running a center for training the terrorists in credit card frauds. And now it is in Pakistan also. They have brought credit card manufacturing machines. Then they train them how to read the magnetic information from the credit cards, get credit cards from petty criminals who steal the credit cards, get the information from hotels, restaurants, and other places. And the estimates are not very sure, but according to one estimate, in US alone, $100 million are generated annually through credit card frauds, and which are used for illegal activities, which includes terrorism also. Now, why these have been flourishing is mostly because the ineffectiveness of the agencies to control the activities of the illegal mafias operating in their countries, the terrorist gangs, or the connivance of the authorities like in Pakistan and many other countries with these terrorist gangs where they flourish. Now, as was brought out, there were several UN resolutions on money laundering and terrorist financing, whether it was 1988 UN Convention as brought out by Mr. Karnail Singh, and the FATF being given task and which made 40 recommendations, which are mostly related to reinforcing the legal system, the role of financial institutions, and the cooperation in fight against terrorism. in financing of terrorism. Now, these three are the main cardinals of these 40 recommendations. But as one can see that even FATF had to keep on modifying their recommendations from time to time. They were revised in 1996, 2003, 2012. And the ineffectiveness of the FATF can be guessed from the fact that Pakistan was brought on grey list in June 2018, and they were given a 27-point action plan. And it's now nearly 2 years. Pakistan still continues to be on grey list. It continues to finance the terrorism against India. And Pakistan has learned the trick of, I should say, befooling these international organizations. Like one of the main charges against Pakistan was terror financing of Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, on which they have not been able to convince FATF that they have stopped funding or action has been taken against them as decided in the 20-point action plan which was given to Pakistan. Now, what Pakistan did, they constituted, changed the terminology of the terrorist gangs. And of late, we have seen the press notes coming under the banner of the Resistance Front, TRF. And Pakistan is trying to give it a color that these are the local terrorist organizations. But essentially, they are the same people who have been carrying out terrorist operations in Kashmir and who are supported, aided, abetted in every respect by Pakistan. Now, this is how Pakistan wants to deviate from the directions given to it, and they know it for sure that they can again hoodwink the international agencies like FATF to continue their operations, illegal operations and illegal financing of terrorists against India. And if you see the global terrorist events which took place at many places all over the world, there was direct or indirect link to Pakistan. And rightly it has been mentioned that Pakistan is the fountainhead of terrorism, global terrorism rather. Now, if we see the UN fight against, United Nations fight against terrorism, there have been many resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly as well as United Nations Security Council. We had, in 1998, we had the Political Declaration and Action Plan against Money Laundering. Then in 2002, we had the International Convention for Suppression of Financing Terrorism. In 2003, we had the UN Convention against Organized Crime. 2005, another UN Convention against Corruption. Corruption is also getting, money generated through corruption is also getting diverted to terror financing. In 2005, we had UN Security Council resolution regarding implementing of FATF 40 recommendations, as Mr. Kanelsi mentioned, the 40 recommendations on which is functioning. Now, it shows the helplessness of FATF that the UN Security Council had to adopt a resolution and give directions to all its members that they should implement the FATF recommendations. And in 2006, we had again the General Assembly UN resolution on cooperation between all nations in fight against terror financing. Now, despite all this effort, things are, the results are not getting achieved. It is primarily because of the role of banks and the financial institutions is not provided with a strong legal system to prevent use of these channels in terror financing. Now, when the terrorists generate the money, they are very careful in hiding the origin and the destination of the finances which they are sending across to terrorists. But as far as the movement of the funds is concerned, they find it that it is comparatively much easier to send the money across, and mostly they have been using, as per the evidence collected, they have been using international banks, because reputed international banks for transmission of these funds, because these international banks develop less suspicion and generally are not put to hard scrutiny. Now, what is required is that we need to have a very strong system of intelligence sharing at global levels to identify the channels, to identify the mechanism by which it's sent, the control on the money agencies, the money transfer agencies. We had one agency in Kashmir which was getting huge money from Europe and Middle East. Ostensibly, it was being sent as the proceeds of the earnings of various Kashmiris who were working there on various jobs. Well, that is correct to some extent.
Sorry for intervention. I'll request to complete it as fast as possible, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just take 2 minutes. Now I'll come to recommendation only, the part. The intelligence sharing at global level has to be strong. The legal system for the functioning of banks and the financial institutions and the money transfer agencies has to be strong, because they are primarily responsible. Then the diplomatic offensive for blacklisting countries which are involved in terror financing, like Pakistan and many other countries in Middle East or in like Iraq, Syria, wherever these are regions. The strong action needs to be taken against them. With these points, I hand over back to Mr. Karnal Singh for further deliberations. I'll be available for any questions.
Sir, thank you so much. It was very lucid presentation of how the proceeds or the terror financing is being generated. Sir, I would clarify about FATF. FATF, the mandate comes from the naming and shaming the organizations. By putting somebody in the grey list, it is telling the world that this country has high risk of investment, and that increases the interest rate if they want to take investment from other countries. But once they are put into the blacklist, then it becomes more problematic for them. So it is basically comes to the economic type of economic sanctions. The another procedure of FATF is that it works on the principle of consensus. We have China as the president of FATF now, and there are a few countries which are supporting Pakistan. So consensus is not building up so easily for putting it to the blacklist. And that is a problem. I agree with you that these institutions are not very strong in implementing the things. Sir, secondly, about the financial systems, we have financial intelligence unit. Almost in each countries, they collect information from the banks. Banks are mandatorily supposed to send information to them. They analyze it, and there is an international coordination between FIUs of the various countries, which is known as Egmont Group. They share between each other also. Now, this is to be exploited by the investigating agency. Now, I request Colonel SM Kumar to talk about the global terror financing. Colonel SM Kumar.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, my friends in India. Good morning to friends in USA and Canada, and good afternoon to friends in Europe. So it is indeed a privilege to be speaking to you all on this topic of contemporary relevance. And as a real life practitioner, let me start from the Bennett end. And I can see in the audience, I can pick up actually some of my very esteemed seniors, General Sudhir Sharma, General Bipin Bakshi, Brigadier Pawar, Lieutenant General Surendra Kulkarni. And I'm sure they and many of my other friends who have been involved in counter-terror operations will relate with this story. So whenever we got hold of any terrorist in Jammu and Kashmir, and we have the DGP of J&K here also, so invariably one of the things that we found was that they were all carrying a diary. Now these diaries were meticulously maintained. Every expenditure, let's say a ground level operative was there, so he would probably get 4,000, 5,000 rupees. If he was a little higher in the hierarchy, 7,000, 8,000 rupees. And similarly, each of the expenses there, you know, what was spent on food, their daily expenses. So everything was meticulously planned, and some money would be paid in Pakistan in Pakistani currency, and some in India in Indian currency. And obviously there were a lot of fake Indian currency notes which were accompanying. So all I'm trying to say is that, and if these guys were, let's say they had a tour of duty for 6 months, and if they had to go on for, let's say, if they had to go on for, say, another 6 months extension, so they would invariably ask for their pound of flesh. So they will ask for more money from their handlers in Pakistan. So everything, the money, the bonus, everything was meticulously recorded. And if they had any kills of Indian commanders or something, so they would invariably be asked for evidence. You show me what, from the local newspaper and, PTI or UNI, one of the local agencies. So all I'm just trying to say is that you spend money on each of the terrorists, then weapons, then equipment, and there are thousands of them. And then there is a whole operational supporting chain, supply chain behind them. So it all adds up to a lot of money. And staying on the same topic, once a journalist intuitively asked me, Colonel, tell me, why do Indians go after weapons and Americans after finance? And I didn't actually think about it. I intuitively told him, look, in India, weapons are very uncommon. So we go after terrorists and weapons. In US, weapon is very common. So they go after the finances. So I still don't know whether I was right or wrong. But having said that, it is good to see India now going at a tactical level at the bayonet end, going after the terrorists and their weapons. And at the more strategic end, we are also, working with FATF and other global agencies to name and shame the perpetrators of terror. So from the bayonet end, let me straight away jump on to the strategic end. And then if you remember, Colin Powell had famously said that money is the oxygen of terrorism. So if we look at broadly, it is two things. One is ideology, and the second is finance, which basically sustain a terror movement. So ideology provides the raison d'etre, and it provides the emotional connect. And finance is what gives it the sustainability, the lethality, and the reach. So terrorist movements mutate and grow directly proportional to the amount of financing they have got. And when the funding dries up, then they wither away and then they splinter into fringe groups. So generally speaking, all terror organizations have a shelf life. And if you look at the organization, if you look at the terror organization, the ideological component is always more difficult to defeat. So the method of choice for all states, global agencies, and counter-terror organizations should be to go after the terror finance. Now, if you look at the definition, there is no universally accepted definition of terror. So accordingly, a lot of confusion abounds on what constitutes about terror financing. So I will go with the IMF definition of terror financing, which basically defines it as any activity which involves soliciting, collection, and provision of funds with the intent of sustaining terrorism or non-state actors. Now it further adds that any person involved in acquiring or facilitating transfer of funds unlawfully or willfully, with either full or partial knowledge of their intended utilization in carrying out any terrorist activity, is liable to be charged and prosecuted under appropriate jurisdiction. So that is what the IMF says. Now I come to a very important point. Executing a terror attack is damn cheap. It's not at all expensive. What is expensive is sustaining a terror movement. So let me give you some facts and figures. 9/11 cost a total of, to Al-Qaeda, it cost about $500,000, and Bali bombings cost just a tenth of that. So just about, not a lot of money. And USS Cole, in which 17 sailors were killed and about 39 were injured, that cost just upwards of $10,000. And terror attacks, even in the Indian subcontinent, they don't cost a lot of money. One of the more expensive ones was 26/11. That also cost about 200,000 US dollars, and that involved a huge logistics. But as I said, executing a terror attack is cheap, but sustaining a terror organization, raising it and sustaining a terror organization and network is damn expensive, because money is required for incorporation, for incubation, it is required for marketing, it is required for recruitment, you have to pay wages to people, outreach, ideology, indoctrination, weapons, equipment, supply chain, a lot of operational activities, PR, propaganda, and lots of it. It functions like a commercial organization, like you saw in the Valley. each guy would come and they would be paid, and they would be paid overtime, and everything, all records had to be maintained, and evidence had to be, supplied for getting weapons. So terror organizations raise money from a large number of sources, and they could come from private donations. Organizations like IRA, LTT, they used to raise a lot of money from this. It could come from profits, business, commercial activities, drugs, extortion, kidnap, ransom, charities, front companies, real estate holdings. And if we look at historically, there has also been, and I'm in private sector now, so historically, there have also been links between corporate powerhouses and terror organization. And there was a lovely article by Pawan C. Lal last year that had chronicled it very well. And these are not restricted to the sectors that you generally believe in, real estate and cinema, but there are other sectors such as aviation. So they have also been under scanner. And in India, very few, the prosecutions pertaining to this terror financing have been in single digits. So prosecution is, judiciary has not been very, very effective. So our legal system also needs to be revamped and strengthened. Funding of terror also depends on the geopolitical or social context. For example, if you look at ISIS, it was in the oil-rich region, so they used to get oil. If you look at the South Indian brigands, they used to involve in sandalwood smuggling. If you looked at Central India, the Maoists would probably sell forest produce. Similarly, teak in Myanmar, or it is, if you go to Golden Triangle, Golden Crescent, or to Colombia, this would be, there would be lots of narco financing. In North India, it's about extortion. And then again, I said some of the global organizations receive good amount of donations like LTT and IRA. And so if you look at the world's richest organizations, I think top 6, 7 would be ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Hezbollah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. And one point that my research showed was that organizations which have a single source of funding, just one source of funding, so they are more vulnerable, because if that dries up, for example, if you're just getting from donors and if there is pressure from influential states, then that funding may dry up. So I will take a case study of ISIS and very briefly cover. So ISIS by 2008-9 used to get a revenue of about $1 million per month. And that grew dramatically to about $1 million and even up to $3 million per day by 2014-15. And ISIL worked like a state with, it had its own borders, customs, taxes, courts, banks. The fighters used to be paid about $400 per month, which was more than what the Syrian rebel fighters were getting or the Iraqi government fighters were getting. So they were pretty well paid. And so that was a more attractive in terms of career. And their revenues came from a lot of other sources. For example, they used to tax small merchants, big companies, petrol station owners, generator owners, pharmacies, doctors. They also had income tax, business tax, tax on cash withdrawals. They had some taxes on non-Muslims, like it was of some form of jizya, what we used to have in old India in Mughal time. There used to be a departure tax. You can leave the ISIL territory and actually you can go out by paying a tax. Bank looting gave them about $429 million. Kidnap was a big industry. James Foley was an American journalist. He was kidnapped. $132 million was demanded in ransom. And when it was refused, he was murdered on video. If we look at drugs, Nineveh is a town on Turkish border, and about 50% of heroin trade of Europe passes through Nineveh. They have also been in harvesting organs like kidneys, livers, hearts, etc. And that has been finding its way into international black market. And old artifacts, some of them up to 10,000 years old. So they have also been kind of selling for up to $10,000. So that is roughly, and I'll just cover 2 more quick things. State sponsorship of terror that declined after Cold War. And in Cold War times, the world really used to be polarized. You know, I'm reminded of once President Reagan was sitting with his A-team, and one of the guys told himself, this Daniel Ortega, this Nicaraguan dictator, is son of a bitch. Reagan told him, is our son of a bitch. So the world was so polarized that we had our sons of a bitch and their sons of a bitch. But after that, state sponsorship declined across the world, but not so much in Indian subcontinent. PAC continues to support, as was already mentioned. ISI has very strong links with Pakistani terror organization, and there are some front charities with strong core radical elements. They have sprung up in over the last couple of decades in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. They also become a cover for radicalization, indoctrination, and are well placed to provide logistic support for movement of funds. Similarly, NGOs in Germany, UK, and Canada have been discovered to have raised money for Babbar Khalsa International. Fake Indian currency notes are produced en masse in Pakistan. If we go a little further, Taliban gets about $150 million from narco financing. And if we look at the total industry, about $2.2 billion are made by drug traffickers in Afghanistan, which must be one of the largest industries. And farmers get about 440 million. So the problem of farmers getting less money and everyone else getting more money in the value chain applies everywhere else. And similarly, APAC, Nepal, Myanmar, Thailand, Colombia, they all have a lot of now, one of the things, the last point that I want to make is that terrorists, criminals, bad guys, they all operate in gray zones and in areas where lines of authority crisscross and nobody seems to be in charge. And even if you see that those who are from armed forces will relate it, most of the infiltration will take on the inter-battalion boundaries. So wherever lines of authority crisscross and nobody is in charge. So if the situation is more chaotic, then it is more ripe for terrorism. And now that the battlefield has expanded to cyberspace, and then cyberspace provides a lot of opportunities from recruitment, indoctrination, to just attacking also. And so we are in a Corona world, my last bit, and in Corona world, we are hit by unprecedented global health crisis and with the worst economic crisis in decades. So there'll be large number of second order effects. There'll be bankruptcy, shutdowns. A lot of people are layoffs, losing job. People are being laid off left, right, and center. There is mass.
Colonel Sam, your mic is on mute. Please kindly unmute it.
Okay. So all I was saying that we are in a Corona world, and so a lot of anger among youth and a lot of street protests across the world. So that's happening, and all this is happening at a time when the world is going through geopolitical recession. So these are, and the big powers just can't agree on anything, even the handling of Corona crisis. So these are indeed very scary times. The problem is global. The response cannot be narrow and parochial. So we would require much greater cooperation at the international level, interstate, interagency level to defeat global terror. FATF is playing a good role. Government of India is also trying hard. So my only suggestion would be that FATF must do its primary duty of naming and shaming and must kind of transfer the perpetrators from grey list to blacklist. So thank you very much. I look forward to listening to Ambassador Haqqani and a lot of other experts and learning from it. I'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Colonel S.M. Kumar. Very well expressed. Particularly, you have hit on the legal system of the country. It is basically starting from the existing laws to the trial. Everything is a slow process. Our laws are not fully efficient enough to deal with terrorism. We have to deal with mostly with the help of CRPC. And there are many issues relating to the arrests and interrogation. But that's again a big topic. Now I'll request Ambassador Hussain Haqqani to throw light on this topic.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting listening to all the preceding speakers who focused on all the technical aspects of terror financing. I would argue that the reason why...
The camera, please.
I beg your pardon? Oh, sorry. I would argue that one of the reasons why people feel frustrated in dealing with terror financing in many... I don't know why it keeps turning off. Again. Is it okay now? Hello?
So we are not able to see you, sir.
I have turned the camera on. I don't know what's happening. The camera just gets turned off repeatedly.
Okay, no issues, sir. No issues, sir. Continue.
I will just continue to speak. I would argue that terror financing is more a political issue than a technical one. That is what has frustrated, say, for example, our friends in India who get upset over various reasons why they feel Pakistan gets away with a lot less than it should be able to get away with. The reason why I describe it as a political problem is that Mr. Kanal saying very rightly explained that the current regime that governs terror financing is essentially just an extension of the regime that was created to deal primarily with organized crime and its financing. After 9/11, there was political momentum. The United States put its weight behind dealing with terror financing. There was a desire on the part of the Bush administration to declare global war on terrorism. The assumption that terrorism for any cause and for any purpose will not be accepted. And at that moment, the FATF played a much more robust role in deciding that it will make all jurisdictions in the world impose and implement laws and rules that will stop avenues for terrorists to be able to move money across borders. What has happened in the last few years is that the post 9/11 anti-terrorism global momentum has diminished. The will of nations and governments to punish anyone who organizes a terrorist group or allows a terrorist group to be organized in its jurisdiction, that will has definitely declined. So we find that today only 2 countries are on the blacklist of FATF, Iran and North Korea. In case of other countries, including the country that has been most this as Iran and North Korea. So it's not just China, it is also Turkey, it's also Saudi Arabia. Several Muslim countries feel that maybe Pakistan should not be subjected to heavier sanctions, at least at this moment. That political decision and the inability to negotiate that political quagmire is the reason why the desire to curb terror financing out of Pakistan is frustrated. Now, as far as the grey list is concerned, yes, it makes it difficult for countries to get and attract investment. But if a country decides that it can live with the grey list, then it does not face a serious problem. In fact, then its objective becomes avoiding the blacklist. The technical criteria, experts, if they decide politically that they want to persist with the process, they can find 100 technical ways of compliance. And so in the end, I think what really is needed is the kind of political momentum that was built after 9/11. The countries that are still targets of terrorism have to persuade others who have started. Americans, for example, have a relatively short memory. And Americans, I live in America, I tell you, I was here soon after 9/11, I'm here now. At that time, the feeling and the sentiment and the political desire to do something about terrorism was far greater than it is now. There is a presumption that we can live with a certain level of terrorism and we can actually make sure that it doesn't hit us at home. But the rest of the world, there will be some form of terrorism, just like there is some form of organized crime always. The global regime needs a definite revision. It needs to be a little more watertight than it has been. And at the same time, the political will needs to be mobilized so that countries that support terrorism are persuaded that they have to be much more assertive in making sure that terror financing does not continue. As far as the technical solutions are concerned, I would argue that the state always has an advantage if it decides to support terrorists or tolerate them, to make it possible for terrorist groups to work around the legal regime, because after all, laws are enforced by the state. And so the state's involvement is always the reason why you have lax implementation of terror financing laws. We see that in case of Iran. Iran wants to support terrorist groups or groups that are considered terrorists by the rest of the world. And so Iran will not implement the global regime to the extent that those groups cannot be supported. Similarly, North Korea is itself a state sponsor of terrorism and wants to bypass the laws. But the problem area are the gray countries, countries that support terrorist groups for political reasons, but the international community is not willing to punish them the same way that it has decided to act against Iran and North Korea. So I would say to this panel today that while we are very good at discussing the technical aspects, I think it is also important to discuss the political aspect. Why is it that in case of certain countries, the international community is willing to act than it is in respect to other countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You have hit the nail, actually. I have been attending the FATF meetings. Both of your points are absolutely true. The political issues, and if the state government, any state or country wants laws not to be implemented, they can always do it. And that's a great presentation. Now I'll request Mr. Loknath Behra, who has investigated many cases on terror financing, to give his views.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, I must say that investigating terror financing is a very difficult job. And if we read the 9/11 report, itself actually acknowledges the fact that it was very difficult and they could not go to the bottom of the entire thing to find out the complete money trail. Well, actually, when I was working with the National Investigation Agency, we did some cases, and sir, you know that many of us know this thing, that the FATF, also the mutual evaluation when it was done, the FIU was found, the red flagging, other things. But actually, we could not, when I came back to the state, I found that it is actually FIU and other things, people do not know how to actually use them. These kind of problems are there. But the silver lining is that India has got one of the best counter-terrorism legislation in the world. The UAPA, after the amendments, 4 amendments, it is one of the finest legislations because we have gone through the legislation of other countries. And Section 17, which is the flagship section relating to the terror financing, is a very, very good section, which can be very easily used. But what happens is that there is a problem relating to the jurisdiction. First of all, we must understand, number one, how the modus operandi, the methodologies adopted by various organizations to finance, get the finance. In 2010, when we were doing some work, some research work, that time there was an authority from Singapore, though he is an Indian, Dr. Arvind Acharya. He actually wrote a book, very authentic book on terror financing, published from England. And that was the starting point for us in the National Investigation Agency to find out, how we have to go after the finance. But every time we wanted to impress on various people in the state police forces to say that you must investigate the terror finance in a terrorist case, there used to be always a speculation that why should we do these things? We are not going to get any enhanced punishment. Unlike in the US, when there is a presidential directive that a terrorist case investigation is not complete unless the terror finance investigation is fully done, that kind of situation is not existing in our country. But slowly and steadily, people have started actually recognizing the fact that terror financing investigation is important. But then there is a problem. The problem is relating to jurisdiction and the technicalities involved. I must tell that during 2010, we listed 16 type of methodologies all over the world used by the terrorists and the terrorist organizations to finance themselves. But today, many of them have become a little bit of redundant or maybe a little old-fashioned. But now with the virtual world, we will talk about Bitcoin, virtual currency, PayPal, and other kind of things which the Indian Mujahideen had used and the ICC is being using. This kind of things are happening. Of course, the self-funding is still there. The ISIS people who left India and joined ISIS, they actually funded their trips. There is still now the extortion is there, Hawala is there, financing by underworld gangs, it is also there. State sponsorship is there. Narcotics is, of course, there, though it is not very much documented in India relating to the cases. And obviously the charities that is there, but all our sponsorship is there. But investigating those things, there is actually a roadblock. Now, there is international money transfer. The international money transfer for that 13673 or 1267, the enabling legislation has to be there in a country. For that, you do require an extraterritorial jurisdiction. But Indian law actually doesn't give that much of extraterritorial jurisdiction. The extraterritorial jurisdiction has been little actually added to the National Investigation Agency recently due to the amendment to the Act. Whereas the state police have, for example, Khoda Sahib is here because we did a lot of cases when he was there, the DG there in J&K. And so what we used to actually say, find it out, if a particular finance has taken place from Dubai, say, it's very difficult to actually do investigation there. You go through a letter rogatory and ask for that. It takes a long time. But suppose, like the Americans, the FBI has the extraterritorial jurisdiction all over the world. That kind of thing is not there in Indian law. If in Indian law, for our foreign guests who are here, I wanted to tell one thing is that this actually Indian Penal Code gives a limited extraterritorial jurisdiction by saying that if an Indian commits an offense outside India, then we can prosecute. If a foreigner commits an offense outside India, it is not possible for Indian law enforcement agencies to investigate. Whereas the Americans have got that particular advantage that they can investigate anywhere in the world, or actually whether the offense has been committed by American or a non-American. So that is one point. Second point is that the difficulty now in investigating the matters in the virtual space, in the Bitcoin or the virtual currency, is extremely difficult. Getting the evidence very quickly on a digital platform and the digital evidence is difficult, but it's not impossible. Now, the emerging trends right now, the Islamic State is currently raising funds through targeted fund, raising campaigns. Money is asked. The money is asked to be delivered through Bitcoin addresses, PayPal, and Western Union channels. So we have a challenge how to investigate. Most actually travels, which actually I have to join ISIS from India especially, we have seen that very low cost. That is all self-funded. And what happens is that now the lone wolf is there. So he doesn't require money. The Colonel Sahab has rightly stated. Gokul Chat case, which actually we that time took a chart, the entire cost of the terrorist operation was 25,000 rupees. But what kind of damage it caused. So the problem is relating to the VPN and the proxies make detection of this Bitcoin transfers very, very difficult. Now, what we have to do is that Another issue is that a large chunk of persons who leave India to join ISIS are based in the Middle East, and therefore how they get the finance and how they invest it here and there is very difficult to do it. But this question is, but there is nothing to worry about. As some said, the international cooperation on terror financing under aegis of 1267 is increasing, no doubt. Nowadays, you ask particular questions to other countries, affected countries, immediately you get an answer. After the answer, we have the MLAT. Then MLAT is quicker than the letter rogatory, so that actually it's very easy. So while we're doing some cases in Kashmir, J&K, when Huda Sahab was the DGP, and when Mr. Raju was the actually my DG in the NIA, so we used to always discuss very, very innovative methods of getting, by saying that widows of war, and they will give money, and they will just bring small amount of money and give it to them, and through that actually they will buy weapons. So if this is actually, this goes on, actually this will go on. Now somebody said about COVID-19, it has actually caused a paradigm change, and I'm sure that this is going to change the terror financing also. The KYC norms will not be the norms that it used to be. It will be a difference will come. So also, you can actually see, I was seeing the Economic Times some days back, the financial frauds all over the world have gone up. So the terrorists also use it. I have no doubt about that on the digital platform. But the question is that Indian law enforcement agencies are very good and our law is there. Only thing is that we should be very sensible. The last thing we wanted to say, as police officers investigating terror financing, because Colonel Singh Saab actually did a long tenure in the Enforcement Directorate and Delhi Police, etc. He knows it very well. Training people on actually various banking laws, transactions. It's a little difficult job, but we took the help of Reserve Bank of India, various financial institutions to train a few officers, and they should be utilized so that the investigations, once the terror financing investigation becomes
स्टार तो काम कर रहा है, दूसरा भी काम कर रहा है. मैं तो ईस्ट पर दूसरे पे हूँ. स्टार भी काम कर रहा है इसमें.
So, sir, actually, I wanted to say one thing, that if the investigation has to be good, we have to learn the actual art of investigation and know all the process of actually financial transactions. For that, actually, Enforcement Directorate took a lot of actually measures. We are grateful to them. The same thing is now also happening. Many of the state police, they are also trying to train the people, police officers in banking transaction, financial investigation, etc. So I am sure that over the period of time, in the years to come, we will have an optimistic, I end it with an optimistic note that we will be doing actually a good job in doing good investigation in terror financing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Loknath. You have really hit the nail on basic investigation problems and how they can be done. I now request Professor Amitabh Mattu, who will talk of how the corona is affecting the terror financing in the world. Professor Amitabh Mattu.
Thank you very much, Kunal Singh ji. I hope you can see me and hear me. And I think we have had am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yeah.
You're audible, we are not able to see you, sir.
I'm just trying to see why I'm not. Can you not see me?
Yes, sir.
As long
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. I think what we have heard is from Khuda Sahab and the gentleman who just spoke is the technical details of how terrorist funding comes into conflict zones, particularly Jammu and Kashmir, and the manner in which the NIA, the ED are collaborating to investigate and to conclude investigations in as short a period possible. What I think is important at this time to realize is that there are international cooperation is built on three important principles. The WHO is in a very different category, but it symptomizes also, like the collaboration on terrorism, how difficult it is to get collaboration and cooperation on issues in which there is politics. Collaboration in international relations is often a function of great power agreement. Hussain Haqqani talked about that there was a moment after 9/11 when there was a great power collaboration. That great power collaboration and the politics surrounding that gets weaker day by day. And that is why it is important to create the conditions under which United States, China begin to feel the importance of collaboration on something like global terrorism. Kanal Singh ji, you've been a part of the Financial Action Task Force and you've seen the 39 members, and the next plenary is in early June, and you'll begin to see that again, in an ideal world, you would have everyone agreeing on almost everything, because financing of terrorism, money laundering is like motherhood and apple pie. How can you disagree with it? The very fact that you have so much disagreement is reflective of the politics of relationships. So you have to ensure that there is global cooperation and every country feels the pinch. On that foundation, you build in principles, and there are obviously collective action problems. This is a common thread. There will be free riders, but you build in principles and practices on the basis of which you can act. Beyond just naming and shaming. I think it's in early June, Pakistan will again have to be proved that it has acted on the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force. And here's an opportunity for us to demonstrate through hard evidence, for instance, where Pakistan is falling short. But beyond that hard evidence, you need to work bilaterally with countries who constitute the task force. Now, COVID-19, you might have thought, will be a pause, will reflect a pause in terms of what's happening in terms of money laundering and as well as terrorist financing. But I think, as someone else pointed out, that what you have seen and witnessed is that because of this pause in terms of what's happening in terms of the pandemic, there's actually been an acceleration and accentuation of both money laundering and anti-terrorism funding. If you look at the latest task force of risks and potential responses, which has been produced by the FATA, you will see that in terms of fraud, in terms of cyber crimes, in terms of misdirection or exploitation of government funds or international financial assistance, it's a new bandwidth of activities which are there visible in cyberspace. Criminals are finding ways to bypass customer due diligence measures. KYC is history. All the other due diligence measures that have been put in place are being circumvented. There's an increased misuse of online financial services and virtual assets to move and conceal illicit funds. There's been exploiting of economic stimulus measures and insolvency schemes as means for natural and legal persons to conceal and launder illicit proceeds. Criminals and terrorists are exploiting COVID-19 and the associated economic downturn to move into new cash-intensive and high liquidity lines of business in developing countries. I think the challenge is of a different order. After the COVID epidemic is over, what you'll begin to witness is an order 10 times the magnitude of what you had witnessed before COVID-19. I'm saying this as an academic. In the real world, Khuda Sahab and you, Kanal Singh ji, may have a different view, but I believe that the exponential increase in the pandemic itself is in some ways reflective of the exponential increase in illegal financing, money laundering, and the spurt of new ways of financing terrorism that you'll begin to see. Unfortunately, and that is my deepest concern, is that we do not have capacities. We do not have capacities in terms of being able to monitor, intervene, and prevent activities of this, especially in cyberspace. Our cyber capacity, even though it's improved over time, is still extremely limited. Even an online platform, for instance, which a secure online platform is not easily accessible to many of us. Till yesterday, we were using Zoom. The online server, the server operates out of China. We don't know whether Google Hangout, where does the server go from? Where does it actually, who is able to intervene and monitor these servers? Most of, even WebEx, most of the online platforms that we're using, for instance, for even communication, are compromised. But that's only a tip of the iceberg. I think there are a large number of challenges. You need training, you need recruitment of the finest young minds. In fact, I would say, as someone had suggested to me in the IT sector, don't hire anyone over 25, because over 25, you do not have the skills to be able to comprehend the new technology that is taking a quantum leap every day. Secondly, in terms of intelligence, I think you talked about, sir, the Edmonds group, but there's of course also the Five Eyes of Australia, United States, Canada, United Kingdom, New Zealand, who have real-time intelligence on, who share real-time intelligence and analysis. Of course, they will find it extremely difficult to do so with India, but even if we are not part of the Five Eyes, at least one eye closed, we can be a part of this. Even if we don't get real-time operational intelligence, I think it may be possible to get second-level intelligence available to us. Third issue is a larger issue, which is that our region, particularly with the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, particularly with the huge capacity of China in the IT sector, is going to become extremely vulnerable, both from terrorist groups as well as from technology. For this, again, you need not just training of officials, but widespread awareness. Part of our education post-COVID should be to alert people on how easy it is for technology to subvert their everyday lives. There's new phrases called the manner in which ransoming is happening on cyberspace, where they will be able to lock into your account and not let you in until you deliver on certain things. But there are other ways, and I think that vocabulary itself needs to be go to the grassroots. I think it is incumbent on leaders like yourself, Khoda Sahab, and others in this virtual space to take the lead and ensure that we do not become passive. Even while we address this pandemic, I think we need to recognize the threat to us post-COVID, post the pandemic, from cyberspace, from funding of terrorist activities will increase much, much more than even in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You have really raised the issues regarding the FATF, the collaboration versus international relations. So let me explain that this is done, but still there are certain countries who will not listen even on the bilateral speaking to each other. The second issue is about the cyberspace. So that is very, very important, because there is a technological gap. Though we have the best cyber experts in the country because India has produced computer experts. But certainly the area of dark web requires specialized training to our officers. There is an onion routing. That means if one wants to investigate this, one will get IP address of one country, then the IP address of the second country, then the IP address of the third country. It becomes really difficult and impossible to investigate ultimately the onion routing. You have raised very, very important points, sir. Thank you so much. Now I request Ms. Helen M. Edwards. She will talk about the 1267, 1373, and what are the problems associated with it. Ms. Helen M. Edwards.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on today. Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, sure. Hearing.
Okay, mine's probably going to be a bit shorter. I come at it from a target of organised criminals. So my take on this is a little bit different, and it's through my own experience that I can actually speak about what I've uncovered globally in the last probably 10 years. So in 2010, I was targeted by international organised criminals via Facebook when I was actually raising a project to help people with wheelchairs. Ultimately, I became blackmailed, I was extorted, I was sent death threats, and I became trapped. And I eventually became too frightened to come forward. I actually began to live a double life, and after several years, I was pretty much at the end of my life because I was living a double life and I didn't see any future. But finally, I had the courage to come forward and raise this with the Australian law enforcement. And my matter was raising with them a national security problem, because ultimately what had been happening via my situation was that money was being laundered, which could have been potentially funding terrorists. There was fraud involved, over $1 million in counterfeit checks, all via, in my case, 3 financial institutions. Unfortunately, today,
Helen, your mic is on mute. Kindly unmute it.
Sorry, there was some interference there. That was probably why. I'll just go back to, did anyone get that I was mentioning money laundering and potential terrorism financing?
Go ahead.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so ultimately today, I have not had anyone in Australia or abroad to step up to remedy these serious crimes. This has led me now to actually submit a request for an investigation via the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That was acknowledged in November 2019. I also raised this with the USA regulators back in 2015, and they actually did charge Western Union on 2 counts of money laundering, which now there's a remission of $586 million going back to 500,000 customers. But unfortunately, that was the only action that the US took, where in fact there were many financial institutions that have actually been aiding and abetting crime. And as you all know in the news, just even in the last 5 days, Westpac Banking Corporation has admitted to 23 million money laundering failures. And that now is actually being investigated further because it's actually now being used to exploit children in the sex trafficking area. So in 2015, I raised this with various people, but to date, no one in Australia has stepped up. So if we looked at the topics covered tonight, we talked about security. As far as I can see, in Australia, we have actually failed the world. We don't even focus on national security or international security, and I have proven that. As far as I'm concerned, what we need to do going forward is to ensure that any elected member in our parliament and our government agencies really need to take security seriously and step up and actually begin to take action. There have been many comments just prior to myself about how law enforcement The Financial Action Task Force, I've pretty much read most charters, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations. To date, I've read a lot of charters, but I have not seen anyone actually do much about it. As far as diplomacy, I'm about honesty and integrity. There's a lot of things that are not being told from Australia, and right now a lot of those horrific stories are coming to the surface. So there's another gentleman on this call and he has a lot of other evidence as well, and ultimately it's only a matter of weeks now we start to see what's coming through from America in relation to the trafficking, the money laundering. Everything's pretty much tied around the Clintons, and Australia's heavily involved in all of that corruption over the last who knows how many years. As far as governance concerned, in Australia, I would have to say that there is no such thing as a rule of law. And if Australia is going to be recognised as a democratic and a serious country, then the rule of law needs to be adhered to, and it's now time for accountability and punishment accordingly for the failure of so many. And in relation to one of the gentlemen just prior to myself talking about cybercrime, if everyone wants to take a look at the FBI, it's called the FBI IC3 site, cybercrime and these actions have been going on for at least 20 years, all right? So the FBI had already exposed cybercrime. And again, as far as FATFA is concerned, and with all due respect to the people here from FATFA on this call, I would love nothing more than to have engagement with you, because I did engage with FATFA in early 2016. I raised serious concerns about the failure of our regulators such as AUSTRAC, ASIC and so on, that they were made aware of some of these serious crimes and things were just pretty much swept under the rug. So again, I'm here as a civilian. I have done everything possible to have engagement with my law enforcement and my country. And unfortunately, not much has happened. So here I am representing my country in the interest of national and international security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Helen, you have raised the issues of how the banking system itself can be involved in the money laundering, and that becomes very serious and very difficult to investigate. Now I request Ms. Cleo Pascal. She will talk about difficulties in prosecution of the terror financing cases.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Everything okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's a very disturbing story, Ms. Edwards. I'm sorry to hear about that. And it gets to the heart of a little bit about what I'll be talking about, which follows on what Ambassador Haqqani was talking about, which is the issue of political will. And before I do that, I'd just like to pay my respects to the people on the panel who are incredibly brave and honest people to be doing what they're doing. It is not an easy job to go after these money lines in the region. It's dangerous. You end up getting transferred. Nobody loves you. You don't have a great pension. So I just want to say it's very appreciated. This issue of political will, I'll be talking a little bit about India, but I do it as a friend of India, and I want to preface it by saying it is a global issue. I'm from Canada. We have really not been great about Khalistani funding into India. So I'm not talking from a position of any moral superiority, but in deference to my Indian friends, especially the journalists and researchers who've been working on this for a long time, it's easier for me to talk about how difficult it is to go after some of these issues in India than it is for some of my Indian colleagues because I'm outside the country. So I just want to talk about why this embedded terror financing and is in the money laundering stream is so difficult to extract. I'm going to talk about how the money is made within India, how it's moved out of India, how it's used abroad, and then how it's moved back into India and why it's so difficult to go after. First of all, money, if your campaign financing regulation in India allows for a very, very small amount of money to be spent on a campaign, which means that for a lot of politicians, even before they get into office, they've had to take some form of black money. So once they're in office, they may be already compromised. Similarly, there is an incentive to import things that India itself could produce very well. So, for example, the big one, obviously, is defense procurement. So if you're better off buying a very expensive piece of foreign equipment where a cut can be taken off the top than to make it in India, and then that money goes into your pockets if you're a politician or a bureaucrat that is involved in that decision making. So then you've got this money and you need to move it out. We've talked about the various systems of moving it out. Hawala is the classic system. Cryptocurrency has also become very popular, obviously. By the way, I'm not going into all the ways you can make money. Colonel Kumar did a great job at all the various different ways. I'm talking about the stuff that ends up affecting political will to go after these networks. When you're moving the money out, if you're using Hawala or crypto or the banks, essentially if you're a politician or a bureaucrat and your money joins all of those other illegal money flows, you have a vested interest in protecting that whole system. So if you made some money off of campaign donations that you weren't supposed to get, and you're using a Hawala network to take it out, and you're in a position politically or bureaucratically to protect the people who are taking your money out, you're logically going to end up doing it. So even though your amount of that money flow may be small, you're part of a system that protects itself. It doesn't matter what the system is. If the system has your money, the system owns you. And so it might be high tech, it might be low tech, it doesn't matter. Once the money is out of the country, there is an incentive to invest it in systems that also protect you and your money. So real estate was mentioned. It's not hard for to know that there's illegal money. You look at the real estate market in New York or in London, and people show up with vast amounts of cash. I mean, clearly that didn't appear out of nowhere. So it's not hard to find. But what ends up happening is also money gets diverted into other, in the comments people have brought up NGOs, but if you're looking at a geopolitical level, you can look at the Confucius Institutes or funding to think tanks, the sort of systems that are in place to, again, weaken the political will of those on the potential prosecuting side to go after you. Then when the money comes back in the specific case to India, again, it might use invoicing, it might use Hawala, that sort of stuff, but it very often uses what has been mentioned several times before, the banking system or Goldman Sachs. I mean, Goldman Sachs was implicated in the P notes issued not that long ago. And there's no structural motivation for a Goldman Sachs or a big bank to go after illegal money flows. So I have a friend who used to work for a very large investment bank in Japan in the risk section, and when he was in charge, they would decline about 8% of the requests for business investment because they didn't look at the individual transactions, they looked at who they were dealing with. So it wasn't so much the money laundering, it was, are these bad people? Because if they're bad people, chances are they're doing illegal stuff and it's a risk to the company. However, they didn't make money off of saying no to bad people. They make money off of taking whatever money they can and then potentially paying a fine later on if they have to. And because there's no effective prosecution, the incentive isn't there. So after he left, the amount that was declined went down to basically zero. So there are all of these mechanisms in place. We've talked about FATF, for example. I think that what we've seen in terms of Chinese influence in WHO, which was just mentioned, is very indicative of what you see when Chinese influence is involved in these international organizations. China tends to try to place itself in international organizations that can go after it. So for example, it's on the Human Rights Commission at the UN. It's at FATF. And I think it's telling that nobody's going after Macau as a major money laundering center, now. And I don't think there's any incentive, again, no political will on the Chinese side to start to go after that. The only incentive they have would be to go after countries that would be a competitor to Macau so that they could funnel more illegal money into their system so that they're in a better blackmail and control situation. In terms of things like the unexplained wealth orders in the UK, so far there's been one prosecution, and it was a woman from Azerbaijan whose husband was already in jail. She was an easy target. There was an attempt to go after some Kazakhs, and that was actually declined. So the mechanisms are in place, but the political will isn't. So the question is, how do you shift the balance of political will? And if you're looking at a place like India, if you have a democracy, I personally think you have a very big advantage. Going after corruption is politically popular. It's what created the groundswell for now Prime Minister Modi when he was in Gujarat. The idea that if you clean up the system, everybody makes more money was very politically popular. So you can, if you're in a democracy and you want to get reelected, anti-corruption is, which is what feeds into terror financing and money laundering is popular, but there are a lot of vested interests that are making a lot of money. So how can you help? How can you start to shift that political calculus? And one way is, first of all, to talk about it, as we're doing here as academics, to get more media coverage, to publicize the investigations more, essentially to raise the cost of doing this sort of thing, throw people in jail so that the benefits are less attractive. Because if currently Goldman Sachs can do what it did in Malaysia, nobody gets punished. So there is very little downside for trying to make millions and potentially billions of dollars. So raising the cost in a range of untraditional ways that affect political will help give cover to all of you great investigators who are doing the work on the ground. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much. You have really raised the issues of, one is about the people who are themselves involved in corruption and money laundering would try to protect those existing structures. And the second is it is difficult to investigate when there are international transactions. How to go about it? That's very important. In India, we have this Prevention of Money Laundering Act. It has two types of investigation. One is a civil investigation, one is a criminal investigation. In civil investigation, the first is the property involved in money laundering is attached. And within 6 months, the adjudicating authority has to take a call whether the investigation was right. And if it is rightly attached, then the possession of the property is taken irrespective of the decision of the case, which may come after 10 years or so. So there is the people are afraid now that if there is a Prevention of Money Laundering Act case, they will go to jail, that is one. But their property will also be taken away, even if the case is being under prosecution. Thank you very much. We have two interventions. The first person to intervene is Ms. Nikita Kohli. I request her to give her presentation. Ms. Nikita Kohli is there?
Hi, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. And of course, it makes things much easier for me coming at the end where like almost all the important points have been discussed on the platform. And we have been discussing a lot on terror financing, and I think it's a great thing that we're doing that today, 21st May, since today has been designated as the Anti-Terrorism Day by the Government of India. Well, simply put, the criticality of discussing terrorism financing today can be underlined very simply. Finance is the mainstay of terrorist organizations. These organizations need to finance attacks on multiple levels, get the right people, give them the right training, arms, ammunition, and other equipment, as well as getting people across international boundaries. So as and when that is happening, they need to have multiple levels of financing, and that is the only part which I think I will be covering today, and which is focusing on both the legal and the illegal methods of, especially in the irregular financing. As I have demonstrated in my research over the years, funding sources of terrorist organizations are not limited to either sources which can be easily traced or extremely covert, such as bitcoins, and neither are the ways that they spend them. As has been mentioned by one of the previous speakers, the credit for these terrorist organizations happens in ways of barter, bribes, ransom, hospitality, hawala, drug money, donation of weapons, stolen cars, theft of objects, smuggling, etc. And the debit happens in other fraudulent ways such as kidnapping, reconnaissance, recruitment of personnel, safe housing, smuggling of drugs, again, travel, weapons and explosives, etc. So, looking at the ways that the terrorist organizations are functioning gives us quite a different perspective rather than a very pure academic one. It makes us look at the funding operations as a way the terrorists are looking at it. Over here, we need to look at not only the actors who are involved, which is not just the terrorists themselves, but also those who are supporting them and those who are doing business with them, but also the ways in which they're moving the finances and the options which can be used for their activities. While most of the terrorist funding or support is in the manner of finances, it usually goes beyond it to include a wide range of actions, such as including logistical support, ideological support, and material support, among other things. Most of these actions are enabled by different people involved in long chains of action. What is common across these categories are four aspects. One, it needs to be reliable. Two, secure. Three, simple. And four, in large quantities. These aspects of financial support have the capacity to influence the strategic behavior of terrorist organizations. When you look at the aspect of reliability, it is actually the most critical criteria which is judged by terrorist groups when looking for support activities. When we go to primary reports and in fact even the diaries of terrorist organizations and even including the leaders, the sources of funding which are predictable and consistent are repeatedly chosen by them over those that fluctuate easily and often. This refers to most of the different kinds of sources, whether they be state sponsorship or diaspora remittances. Reliability of funding sources usually needs to be developed over time and it needs to have a sustainable source. So this means that even if you're having an extortion of a particular group by terrorist outfit in absence of any state presence in the short term, it will not be a reliable source in the long term if communities cannot make enough money to keep paying the bribes or the payment to the terrorists. This is clearly visible when you look at the groups in the northeast of India, where even when they're having these pink slip systems, if I may call it that, they are actually also helping multiple of these people by building different housing societies and actually getting them a lot of work. This also relates to the final aspects, which is about coming in large quantities. This is one of the most important factors when calibrating when terrorist organizations can carry over long periods of time. If the sources of funding are not reliable and cannot be procured over long periods of time, they would not serve the terrorist organizations since their aim is often not related to political control over a particular territory, well, at least not always, which can result in taxation at a later period. This is one of the major reasons why many of these groups look for state sponsorship. The states can provide them with enough money, armaments, reserves, and sometimes even land and political support that they may need, despite the fact that they often have to adhere to the ideas of targets of the state, including not attacking particular areas or particular segments of population, which they need to. This can be seen in Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, which is supported by Pakistan, which are not allowed to target Kashmiri population, since that is the part of India which they tend to win over. But however, they're given free rein to attack any other part of India, as can be seen in the 26th 26/11 Mumbai attacks. Last point is that financing needs to be secure. If the financing link is open to international governments or to governmental security, it does not make for a safe or reliable source for the terrorists to go back to. Such supporting actors need to be able to operate both legally and illegally prior to linking the state operations to the side operation of funding or supporting other terrorist organization towards its aim. So this needs to be done simply. If there are a large number of actors involved, you need to deliberate on each step. When I'm looking at some of the recent discussions which are happening on these chat groups and everything, they are actually quite against Bitcoin. In fact, Access is one of the very few which have gone for it because it is so complicated. And it often you end up losing competition to other means of financing and support activities. There's petty theft, credit card frauds, and which require fewer skills, less personnel, and it's less risky. All of these factors have led to massive change in trends in funding. While state sponsorship was obviously the number one chosen methods during the Cold War years, with each side funding and operationalizing various different terrorist organizations, the sources have dried up. And it has put a lot of groups such as those in Afghanistan, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and others in so much trouble that they could not find funding, at least stable funding from states, which led to the creation in the first place. And in the 1990s onwards, we have looked at multiple alternate sources, such as those which are drug funded and other methods. But right now, this is changing again. And now it's looking at these e-wallets and other easier methods of getting across. So one of the interesting things which I recently came across is an arms dealer who works sort of in the gray zone in India, and he's operating mostly through Paytm. Paytm allows him to add transfers of about 1 lakh without any governmental oversight. You can easily use your funds from the banks, and any regulation which is anywhere available will not target Paytm. So such structures, payment structures which rest on top of banking structures, but are still divorced from it on the critical aspects, are being used currently and with great effect, I'll say. Another thing is that we need to look at the way that these value chains are being created. Terrorist organizations, especially those which work over long periods of time, they don't simply look at money as coming in from one source. For funds for them can include different kinds of inputs, which they're converting into the output of terror via the mechanism that adds to product, to value to the end of product, let's just say. That is, they take a primary input, say, of ideology, religious extremism, money, labor, weapons, and all of that, turn it into the specific output of attacks, territorial governance, political power, social welfare, and other such methods, via the mechanism of money laundering, cabal extortion, and so forth. So this is the value addition process which is still continuing over there. This is very clearly visible in areas such as those car dealerships, which provide modified cars to terrorist organizations. They mostly do legal business, but are contracted by terrorists to usually a middleman to make the purchase. So in the case of the Tehreek-e-Taliban, of the Pakistani Taliban, they use a middleman to acquire particular types of Toyota cars, but only those which are made in Canada because they're seen as high quality and therefore, more reliable. In fact, this has led to many Taliban fighters seen sporting the tattoo of the maple leaf in support of Canada. And then these, the middlemen are then contracted out. Those who have intelligence of where particular petrol stations are and how they can bribe these patrol officers to be able to get the cars to a particular spot for the Taliban, where it is deposited and then the money is transferred back to them. So these are new categories which are coming up. But at the end, I will conclude with one important point. That any way that we need to look at terrorism financing needs to look at the 4 criteria. It needs to be reliable, it needs to be secure, it needs to be simple, and it needs to be in large quantities. So looking simply at issues, say, like Bitcoin, will not actually fit all of these criteria. And that is why they're being used very rarely because they can't be used further ahead. And I think I'll just end over here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikita. You have elaborated about what type of sources of funds for terrorism are sustainable, reliable. You have also told that how the money is transferred across. It's a very valuable inputs. Thank you very much. Our second special intervention is by Mr. Shirish Nitke. I'll request him to give the presentation.
Thank you, Karnal Singh ji. First of all, I have to acknowledge that I saw a lot of pretty renowned experts in this panel here, and we got a lot of pretty insightful views from a geopolitical point of view on money laundering. And I'd like to put it in a slightly different context. As some of you know, I'm from the industry of banking and finance, and we specifically work on banks and with banks and financial institutions on managing their financial crimes exposure. So from that context, I'd like to mention just a few points. One of them is that the quantification of the problem. Now, all of you know that money laundering represents about 5% of the global GDP. That's from the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime. That's about $2 to $3 trillion. Now, what is not as publicized is the fact that about $25 billion is actually intercepted by some form of law enforcement in the world, which is less than 1%. You have $2 trillion, $3 trillion going through the banking system, $25 billion intercepted. Let me give you another number. The banking industry, which I work for, spends $180 billion a year in anti-money laundering activity. Now, just look at these numbers for a minute. Less than 1% of money laundered through the banking system is caught. We spend $180 billion to catch $25 billion. And that doesn't count the fines the banks have paid. So Helen mentioned Westpac earlier today. They're probably getting $1 billion fine coming up soon. Banks have paid about $200 billion in fines so far, and just about $8 billion last year, and probably another $8 to $10 billion this year. So the $180 billion doesn't include the fines that the banks pay. The point I'm trying to make here is, if we call this a war on money laundering or war on terrorism, we are clearly losing. There is no black and white about it. Whatever we are doing is not sufficient. It is no way even scratching the surface of what the problem is with less than 1% and with the amount of money that's being spent. The second point I'd like to make is that the whole aspect of money laundering is actually a well-managed business. And like any other well-managed business, they have money flows. And I think there was a reference earlier to about how ISIS moved their revenues from $3 million a day to $1 million a month to $3 million a day. That requires a lot of sophistication in finance as well as in technology. And there is a FATF report, the FATF report that came out a couple of weeks ago, which related to how these businesses have responded to the COVID crisis. I mean, just like you see legitimate businesses like car companies started making ventilators, or alcohol distilleries started making sanitizers. The folks in the bad actors have actually also changed their business model to take advantage of the COVID crisis, specifically by targeting stimulus packages or creating new typologies or creating more creative ways of laundering money than they had before. So the point is, we are in a war of wits against some very, very sophisticated people who are sophisticated both in business as well as in technology. Now, the third point I'd like to make, and since I have a vested interest in the technology industry, the technology sophistication of the money launderers is very high. And I would say from the white hat side, that the good guy side of it, we are way behind. And and it's kind of I would say regrettable that technology is not being is grossly underutilized, this fight on crime and fight against money laundering. Specifically, as I think somebody mentioned earlier about the fact that we should talk to people who are under 25 for technology. I think that's probably some different views on that. But if you just look at the areas of artificial intelligence and money laundering and pattern recognition, these are the kind of problems which computer scientists can solve. In trying to find out bad guys from good guys, what we're really doing is trying to find needles in haystacks, or like the computer scientists say, needles in a stack of needles. This is a computer science problem, and it's about time we got more of the brains behind the computer scientists working on this and use that to solve the problem. It is, right now, I'd say they're much more underutilized. Just to give you quite an example, one of the areas that FATF talks about pretty often is a risk-based approach. And all of you have heard that risk-based approach in some form or the other. When you talk about a risk-based approach, it means you put more resources on people who are high risk, less resources on people who are low risk, and sort of modify your law enforcement behavior accordingly. Just to give you a simple example let's talk about airport security. Now, 20 years ago, like just after 9/11, somebody put a bomb in his shoe and was caught in I think out of London, going to the United States, and he was apprehended, and that case was kind of handled. But the more important outcome of that situation was 20 years later, we still have to take off our shoes when boarding an airplane. Okay, now, what are the chances of a terrorist putting a bomb in his shoe in this day and age? Probably 0.001%. Yet, we spend an enormous amount of resources chasing down what we would at best call a false positive. So the technology is there to tell you, the business processes experts are there to tell you that this is a waste of time, and yet we are very slow to make changes like that. That's just an example of how we are talking about a risk-based process in theory, but not deploying it in practice. So I'd conclude my remarks there, but just 3 points I'd like to make. One is, just looking at the numbers, we are losing the war. Secondly, if you want to win the war, we have to realize that we are in a war of wits against people who are very sophisticated, both technologically and financially. And thirdly, we have to use what we would call modern technology. Things like AI, machine learning, which has made advancements in the last 4 or 5 years, can have a significant impact. And I'll conclude my remarks right there and be happy to have comments and questions for the people who have already spoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have really raised the issues relating to the difficult investigation to find out in the enormous amount of data and to pinpoint what could be the important information. Yes, that is very, very difficult, and technology can come for its aid. We have finished with the speakers, and the special intervention is also over. There are 2 questions which I have got. The one is about, can you explain the role of cryptocurrencies in laundering terror money? Now, it is open to the speakers, and anyone can reply about it.
Let me see if I can take a quick stab at it from my side. One of the advantages of cryptocurrency, or I would say the features of cryptocurrency, is the anonymity it carries with it. And in a sense, from a money laundering perspective or a criminal perspective, it's untraceable. And this is exactly the same as cash. I mean, the reason why cash is so used pretty extensively is that there is no trace of where it goes and where it's been. It's just there, and that's what cryptocurrency is supposed to be like. The problem of cryptocurrency has a lot to do with, let's say, the fact that it's not a federal currency, it's not a fiat currency, it's more of an independent currency, and it's hard to track down. Now, while some of the technology may exist, there are technology approaches by which you can catch money laundering activity by looking at patterns, but they're still very hard unless you identify the source or the owner of a particular account. So it is a challenge. It's a problem. It's not a problem that can be easily solved, but there are ways of attempting it.
Thank you, Sirish. The second question is about, and I put it to Mr. Kuldeep Khoda. Given the pandemic situation, can terror groups and individuals exploit the situation in the name of charity to further their false causes? Sir, I'll repeat. Maybe you were not there on the seat. Can terror groups and individuals exploit the situation in the name of charity to further their false causes?
Absolutely, this is a very important question, I must say, because the pandemic all over the world has put a lot of economic strain on various countries, on most of the countries, in fact, and which ranges from severe to most severe situation. And it is going to create crisis all over the world for the next 1 year at least. That's the view of the experts. Now, any shortage of money, any economic crisis leads to increase in financial crime. And since we have already organized cells working, some working independently and some working with the patronage of the government like Pakistan and others, so the organized crime is bound to increase, and terror financing is part of the organized crime. It was brought out by another speaker earlier also that the pandemic situation, Mr. Amitabh Mattu brought it out, and he mentioned very rightly that this is, of course, going to affect in the months to come the terror financing, and it can increase, affecting the terror situation in the world, especially in India.
Thank you, sir. There is another question. I'll put it to Colonel S.M. Kumar.
Yes, sir. Please,
What effects will,
please let me know the question.
What effects will it have on these laundering procedures? I'll repeat it again. Speaking of geopolitical considerations, that is annexing POK, what effects will it have on these laundering procedures? Considering the people in POK won't be happy with the move, the terrorist operations are bound to go up. Is India ready to counter such advances through any proposed stringent legislation? Have you got it, sir?
Yeah, it looks like a kind of a very open-ended question. It has
Yes.
elements of geopolitics, it has elements of legislation, and it has elements of... So again, so if we look at the geopolitical side of it, we have always claimed it as a part of us. And you know, we have also gone on a diplomatic offensive these days. So our maps have been showing it all the time. Our now weather agencies are also showing it, and even Google in India now shows it as part of us. So one is the geopolitical part. The second is the winning hearts and minds. You know, it's just not about occupation of a part of it. So second is handling the I think the people part of it, the winning hearts and minds of it. And so any military occupation also or militarily claiming part of the territory has to be accompanied by the civil administration and winning hearts and minds. Otherwise, we have seen things going wrong in many other parts of the world when countries have intervened and they have not taken. And third is, of course, the legislation part of it. And again, we have seen that there is a lot of misinterpretation. Let me just take one aspect of it, zakat. So let's say zakat. So zakat ko bolte hain that it is supposed to be used for three things. So one is supposed to be, one of them is supposed to be in the name of Allah. Now in the name of Allah ko misinterpret karke they can, they misinterpret it and put it in the name of jihad. So again, the correct interpretation has to be, put across to people and put across. So on all multiple fronts, geopolitical, military, diplomatic, economic, legal, the global, narrative and global support around it, all aspects have to work on it for any measure to be successful. So that's very simply I can put to a very long open-ended question.
Thank you so much. Next question, can I ask Ms. Cleo Pascal? The question is on, as anarchy rules international arena and international organizations are failing to keep a check, what other ways can be used to actively ensure a pressure on governments?
Well, that's a key question. Again, I would probably go back to, it depends on what kind of a government. So if it's a democratic government, then the media is extremely important. You know, I wrote an article recently about some of the things that have been going on in India, mostly for a U.S. publication, mostly because it's difficult to publish that sort of stuff in India. And the reaction within India was very strong because people know what's going on, but once they, you know, once it's crystallized in a way that that helps them understand how deep the problem is, then they're much more likely to get involved and become active in trying to find solutions. And if you're in a democracy, that puts increased pressure on the political class to at least respond to how their whatever action or inaction there might be. If you're dealing with China, then you know you have to hit them where it hurts from the outside, because from the inside they're certainly not going to change their system. They have the people who are there have a big vested interest in it, and it becomes, you know, very much about targeting the people at the top. You know, so in the same way that you know, the U.S. has gone after you know, Iranian leadership for being bad actors, I think there's a very good case to go after the Chinese. You know, Chinese top leadership. You know, they've got. Xi has his daughter, or had his daughter, to university in the U.S. So there's, you know, finding the pressure points and the entry points depend very much on the sort of government you're dealing with, and figuring out what their weak points are. So the whole psychological aspect of it, combined with a whole suite of tools, from you know, media to disproportionate assets to, depending on whatever you have to hand. But at the same time, from the other side, there has to be the political will to do it. You know, it's not easy. It's this takes a very specific sort of country or person to be willing to do it. You know, in the U.S., very quickly, if you're at the FBI and you're doing this sort of file, you might only have a posting for 3 years. So you're going to go after low-hanging fruit. You're not going to go after the big, complex international cases. You're going to go after picking up the low-level guys as quickly as you can, so that you can, when you go up for the promotions boards, you can say, you know, I've arrested 3, 4, 5 people, but they might not be important in any way whatsoever. So if there's no political will and the structures of the systems aren't designed to encourage it, it becomes very difficult. So you need to find these different entry points that go above and beyond and complement some of these existing systems.
Thank you, Ms. Cleo Pascal. Professor Amitabh Mattu is there. Mr. Loknath Behra?
Not really.
Loknath Behra is not there.
No. He's with the CM.
Mr. Loknath, the question for you is, the government has recently announced collateral free credit line for the MSME as part of COVID-19 rehabilitation. How do we ensure that this scheme is not used for terror financing?
Behra is not there, sir.
Loknath is not there?
No.
Hello?
No, sir.
Okay. And Professor Mattu is also not there?
No, sir.
Then I'll come back to Mr. Kuldeep Khoda. Sir, can you speak on this issue? Do I repeat, sir?
I missed the question.
Sir, I'll repeat it again. The government has recently announced collateral free credit line for the MSME as part of COVID-19 rehabilitation. How do we ensure that this scheme is not used for terror financing?
You know, any distribution of relief, particularly in the COVID crisis, when the relief has been announced, not exactly relief, the fiscal measures which have been announced in the form of relief and the loans and other forms of stimulus, amounting to about 10% of GDP, is an enormous amount. And obviously, the proper use or misuse of these funds going into the hands of the users finally depends on how effectively the distribution is made and how effectively checks are done to ensure that it's used to the proper person and is utilized for the proper cause only. So obviously, the mechanism needs to be worked out very well. But in the present case, in India, most of the finances are going through banking channels to individuals directly, instead of going to groups and then getting dispersed in an indirect manner. Most of the funds are going directly to into the hands of the persons who need them. So the chances of these funds getting misused to a large scale are very minimal, though of course few deviations can be expected. And I'm not really convinced that this can be a sort of threat or a source of threat as far as financing the terrorists is concerned. So the checks and balances are there, and the online mechanism will help that process.
Thank you, sir. And it's absolutely, I may add it that the funds which are going to the public can be misused if that public is part of the scheme of terrorism. Otherwise, it cannot be misused.
Can I comment on that really quickly from the American perspective?
Yes, please.
So the Small Business Association of the United States did about a $600 billion stimulus package a few months ago. It's about $650 billion. And the Auditor General, that is the Inspector General of the SBA, released a report a few months ago saying that in the past, this is again the US, past stimulus packages, there has been an instance about 40% of inappropriate or unsupported documentation that has been, I would say, been used for inappropriately used. Now, those numbers are for the US where the controls are pretty strong. So I would tend to challenge the previous speaker's comments saying that if you're dealing with a very sophisticated criminal end, they will find a way to get to those stimulus funds. And it is, while it's not easy, it is entirely possible.
Let's see the terror funding in India. If we go to the northeast of our country, it is by extortion from almost everybody. If we come to the Naxal area, it is again extortion of different kinds. Even they are taking money from the poor people. If we come to the Kashmir, basically money is coming from the neighboring country. Even for jihadi terrorism, the money is coming from the neighboring country. Now, under these circumstances, I agree with Mr. Kuldeep Khodar. What he says is that it depends upon the people concerned. And in our country, the money is directly going to the people. It is a direct delivery. It is not going, the people do not have cut in between who can make corruptions and then put into the system. So we have to understand the situation in India, that how it is being used and how terror funding goes into the hands of terrorists. We'll take up the next question. It is about...
Sorry, sir, if I may interject here.
Yes, please, Nikita.
Hi, once again. So I think that there's some things which are happening in India which are not actually always direct. Let's just put it that way. For the first time, if you look at the Naxal areas, do you remember that in 2003, after the attack in Kolkata, the LET Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists which were there, they actually went from Kashmir, from Calcutta, and they stayed at a place of a sympathizer in Jharkhand, and instead they actually just gave them lots of weapons to them. So it's not always that it's happening in the manner that it's direct to the people. There are lots of different ways of funding which are happening. Next, if we look at the Northeast, of course, there's so much which is happening that every checkpoint that you have, when you're traveling through the Northeast, you have to pay a bribe. And that's even for the people that are there, even for the administrators who are posted there. regularly the army commando over there keeps posting these pictures of where they're getting the money from and the slips that they're posting. So I think cooperation between terrorist groups can also be taken as something that is happening for funding them. This is an interesting factor. Just wanted to add that over here.
Thank you, Nikita. Thank you so much. The next question is, can you please enlighten about the counter-terrorism mechanism India could follow to contain the post-pandemic terror funding in its land? I'll request Colonel SM to speak on this.
So firstly, let me just look at 2-3 aspects. One is I'll take the last question itself, and then I'll come to this one. So, so if we look at, so somebody asked about this, MSME loans and all, and I am myself a MSME co-founder of a startup. So if you look at banks, so government is just the guarantor. So it is becoming guarantor, and banks are supposed to give loans. And banks are just the most conservative creatures you will ever meet on the planet. And whether they're in US or whether they're in India. So even as an entrepreneur, it's very, very difficult to get loan. And if you don't pay, irrespective of whether government is guarantor, they get after your life to make recoveries, and they put all kinds of pressures. And it's really not funny, sir. So the chances of, and banks have their own checks and balances and their own systems in place. So the chances of going it in hands are as good or as bad as they were early. So it really doesn't make too much of a difference. Second is, one of the people who had put a question, and that I will take along with this question, because that more question will come. Will economic slowdown lead to COVID-19? Will the economic slowdown due to COVID-19 reduce the sources of fund for terror? Now, if you look at India, a lot of problem comes from neighboring country. And what happens is that when countries are going through their own internal problems, you will find that they try to externalize the problem. And this is just straight from the old playbook, So whenever there is an internal problem, Videshi takhton ka haath hai, and you just externalize the whole problem. You see Pakistan doing it, you see China doing it. When China is under pressure, you will find China directly introducing some skirmish and something else, and again coming through Nepal. So the dynamics are a little more complicated than direct weather. And as I had said, executing a terror is not that expensive. It's just maintaining the organizations over a period of time, and sustaining them is expensive. So when if a country, let's say Pakistan, is too much pushed to because of economic hardship and other things, and then there is a lot of public opinion against the government, one sure way to tide away from that is to create problems on the India front. So sometimes people try to find external solutions, and this is right from the old playbook. Now, what was the question, sir, Colonel, sir?
I'll repeat it. Can you please enlighten about the counter-terrorism mechanism India could follow to contain the post-pandemic terror funding in its land?
So again, whether it was pre-COVID or post-COVID, I don't see there is. I think the solution to terror remains. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. So you have to you have to up the diplomat. Diplomats have to play their role in building the international consensus and getting FATF to maintain pressure on Pakistan to reduce the funding on that. We have got good legislations. I think the prosecution and implementation of those legislations, so that is the issue. The third is the cyber security challenges are rising at a very, very rapid pace. And I have done some numbers on it. Whole world, all physical and environmental problems led to about $326 billion worth of losses, and cyber losses were close to $3 trillion. So that's again a big space where government has to, and we have to build a lot of capacities, and some 4,300% rise in spams were there over the last 2 months, and a lot of things. So again, diplomatic front, at the tactical level, I think we'll have to keep up the pressure in Kashmir on the ground level. We can't let our guard down. Even a little bit on some pressure is coming from China. So we have to keep up the pressure from security forces on the diplomatic front. On the cyber side, we have to expand the capacity, and on the legal, diplomatic, and the wonderful investigators who are on the panel, and I'm sure they can add. So we have to so again, it will continue to be a multi-agency, multinational, international agencies, and institutions like DRI and all also have to be strengthened. so that because the bad guys are also becoming sophisticated. So we have to, our agencies also have to become more sophisticated, and we have to cut down the gaps, because terrorists and bad guys always flourish in the gaps. So we have to cut down the gaps where they can flourish.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Colonel SM himself. Let me take up this question. The question is, lot of illegal funding is being routed to several media houses and think tanks. Have we any methodologies to track and curb them? See, first, let us understand the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The Prevention of Money Laundering Act talks of proceeds of crime to be attached. Now, what are the proceeds of crime? Proceeds of crime are relating to those criminal activities which have been scheduled in the Act. So there are 13 acts which have been put in the schedule of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. And there should be a criminal activity. That means somebody should be involved in a criminal case. Then only the Prevention of Money Laundering Act will come into operation. Now, even if the illegal money could be the crime money, it could be the black money. Black money is basically which is evasion of income tax. Now, if that money is going into the media or to the think tank and it is generated within the country, then there is no mechanism in the Prevention of Money Laundering Act to deal with it unless there is a criminal case registered against that particular media house or think tank. Now, if this money is coming from abroad, then there is a mechanism in the Ministry of Home Affairs. So foreign contributions are routed through that, permission is to be taken. So there is a mechanism for that. But there is no mechanism if this illegal money has entered into the media houses. The investigation cannot be taken up until there is a criminal case registered. Mr. Aditya, if there is no further case, I hand mic over to you. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we can listen to you loud and clear.
Mr. Aditya.
Good evening, sir. I believe Mr. Teku has some issues.
Hello.
Hello, sir. I believe Aditya sir has some connection issues. He would be joining in shortly.
So, any other point of discussion the panelists want to take up themselves?
I think there are some experts in the audience, and I'm sure they may want to give some points. I can definitely see one or two of them, very seasoned experts.
Who are those? Can you tell?
Yeah, I can see Basant Panwar was there.
Can I request Mr. Basant Panwar to give a very brief, if he wants to speak something?
And Cleo had very little time, and that was very fascinating insight. I think a good global perspective.
So we can request her, if possible, if this Cleo Pascal wants to speak something more.
Sure, I'll just mention. I'll just actually answer Colonel Kumar's question about the media houses. So this is and NGOs and stuff. So I know that the situation outside of India is very problematic, and I work for two different think tanks. One of them, FDD, takes no foreign funding at all, no non-US funding, and it's given a liberty to its research that is unusual in Washington. The other think tank I'm affiliated with, which I won't mention, does take a wide range of funding, and sometimes that can raise some issues. In terms of India, India unfortunately still has way too many of its colonial British laws on the books. And usually that has worked against the so-called good guys in India, because if you want to audit somebody or arrest somebody or whatever, you can find a law. You don't need a specific anti-money laundering law or whatever to harass somebody and to try to push them in the direction you want them to go in. And you can tie them up in the courts for decades. So those laws currently often are not used for particularly salubrious reasons. But if the good guys want to go after the bad guys, those tools are there for you as well. Personally, I would think it would be better for India if a lot of those laws were taken off the books, because that kind of colonial mindset of governance has really been holding India back in a lot of different ways. But it comes back to this political will. If the political will is there to clean up the country and to make it be the incredible, vibrant democracy that it is trying to be, and that actually fundamentally the world needs, especially now. There's an opening because of COVID. We talked about COVID in terms of terror, but in terms of geopolitics, people are talking about China and decoupling from China in a way that they haven't ever. And USAID, a lot of organizations are actively looking at how to transfer production and cooperation into India. So this issue of money laundering, terror financing, which dovetails with all sorts of other corruption issues, which leads to governance issues, is holding India back. It's holding Indians back. Indians do extremely well in places like the US, where they don't have to deal with those sorts of bureaucratic constraints on their innovation. So the same sort of regulations that have been used for bad can be used for good, although it would be even better if they didn't exist at all, for the sake of Indian growth internally and geopolitical positioning. Thank you.
Ms. Helen Edward, you want to say something more?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Aditya, we are almost finished. We are almost finished. So you can take over.
Well, thank you, Karnal Singh, sir. It was truly a very great session, and with remarkable speakers, given the takeaways about the global cooperation on terror financing and money laundering. And the best part that we have been talking on this issue on a very prominent day, that is the Anti-Terrorism Day today. So first of all, I would like to thank all the esteemed speakers, and yes, also our dear moderator, who is also the Executive Council member for GCTC. I would like to ask all the speakers if they want to share the last comments, so that we can maybe end with this.
We can start with Mr. Kuldeep Khoda.
Yes, please.
Sir, you want to make any last comment?
Khoda sir.
Hello. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
No.
Sir,
Okay, my last comment will be that we have to realize the fact that neither terror is gone nor terror financing is gone. And since last 3 decades, Pakistan has not amended its ways, despite lots of diplomatic and global pressure. Countries like US and many other European countries, the developed countries, have pointedly mentioned, and that too repeatedly over last decade or so, that the epicenter of global terrorism is Pakistan. But and the FATF pressure is also there. Despite all these things, and the diplomatic pressure built by India also, despite all these things, Pakistan is continuing with its terror game. And it's mainly because the state of Pakistan and the army establishment, the ISI, is openly supporting it and making a mockery of the entire UN resolutions and also the FATF directions. So India has to take on Pakistan on its own, not depending much on the international means to put pressure on Pakistan. So we have to develop our own capabilities to take on them, to make it costly for Pakistan to indulge in terror activities against India. So whether it is financing the terrorism or terrorism itself, India has to finally come up with solutions. And of course, it will be good if there's backing of other major powers and the United Nations. But to depend on others like the global bodies to do the bidding for India, that will be impractical, as we have seen during the last 3 decades and earlier in Punjab terrorism also. So we had to develop the capabilities for that. And for that, whatever is required to be done, whether it's the covert actions, the overt actions, they making it really costly for Pakistan to indulge in terror activities, we have to develop those capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Helen Edward.
I would just like to say it's been an honour to be with such like-minded people that are speaking about the truth and actually doing something about this global problem. Unfortunately, in my country at the moment, we don't have a group that are really stepping up to actually tackle this problem. There's a lot of talking, but there's not a lot of action. We've recently had various royal commissions. We've got political parties that really have resisted having investigations, and we don't actually have any anti-corruption body to investigate and take on some of the really serious issues that are going on. Anyway, thank you again. Thanks, Adita, and thanks, Todd.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Colonel S.M. Kumar.
The problem is global, so response can't be narrow and parochial. So we have to deal with it at a global level. And big thank you to Global Counterterrorism Council for this initiative, and keep up the great work. And thank you to the wonderful audience for sticking with us till so late at night, and particularly to all my esteemed co-panelists. It's been a great learning session. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Cleo Pascal.
Oh, I'd echo Colonel Kumar's sentiments, and also say, how important the work of GCTC has been in this. Creating this community has been very motivating, not just for what's happening within India, but for those outside of India to know who to connect with in India who are working hard on these very, very sensitive and crucial topics. So thank you very much to Aditya and the team and the co-panelists, everybody who showed up late at night, even though I'm sure they had a delicious dinner waiting for them in the other room, and to our fine moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would say that terrorism has never won. It is a long-drawn process. The security forces have to work hard and win the battle. The battle which would always be in the end in their favor. I thank all the panelists, Mr. Aditya, the listeners, and the GCTC. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you all. Maybe John has to make up a point. John, please, you just have 30 seconds, please.
Hi, good evening to all. Yeah, good evening to all. If you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is John Thangalsa. I'm a research scholar here in the Center for International Politics and Disarmament in the Diplomacy and Disarmament Division, JNU. I'm under Professor Mattu. Hello.
Yeah. Professor Mattu is not here, but you can...
Okay. I'm also a consultant with the National Human Rights Commission. So basically my question is to all the speakers. When you're talking about the money laundering aspects in India and elsewhere, I come from the Northeast, Manipur. So the state of Manipur back in 2015 witnessed a horrendous attack. The Indian army was ambushed and butchered. I mean, I wouldn't say use that word, but they were ambushed by a group of insurgents and non-state actors in the border of Myanmar. So what happens is what happened was even the Ministry of Home Affairs was clueless as to where the money for those weapons came from. So now my question is that in a scenario like this, God forbid, in the near future, if you were to avoid a scenario like this in the near future, how can we strengthen the the home ministry establishments or even the security establishments in the Northeast to control such control the black marketing of such weapons, the funding of such weapons, and the finances and the money that finances all these black market, these weapons. So, to all the speakers, open.
Mr. John, everybody knows from where funds to terrorists in Northeast are coming.
Right.
See, so saying that MHA was clueless, I don't think that's the right phrase.
Okay.
We all know it's basically extortion going on in that area. Trucks are paying, people are paying the amount.
All right.
So that's the money they are getting. Now the government of India is negotiating and trying to solve the problem there. Even Manipur, Nagaland, see, Mizoram has become peaceful. If you see, Mizoram had insurgency, but 1987 it got totally free.
Okay.
Tripura is got totally free from that. Now recently the government of India has got negotiation and signed a treaty with the Bodo extremists also.
All right.
So things are coming into proper shape.
Okay.
The government is working on this. They are aware what is happening there, but they want to control it properly so that peacefully this solution can be found out.
All right.
Anyone else who want to comment? Then we can close this. Colonel Sam, Sudeep Khoda sir.
I think.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I agree with what the esteemed moderator said. So I think there is. I think now we've been in the game long enough, so the bad guys knows where we come from and we know where they come from. So I think it's a battle of wits. But whenever such an incident happens, let's say that incident happens, and you said what happened on the Indian Army, there was a retaliation. So there was a retaliation, and it involved going across the border and hitting out the camps. So there was a retaliation at tactical level, the retaliation at. So how to get things better is that all the plethora of intelligence agencies. So we have to kind of, how that unity of intelligence so that we get one unified intelligence picture and good operational intelligence so that we can act in real time. So that would be at the tactical level. So tactical level activities will always have its importance, but we should not forget all the other activities, which happen at the strategic level, global level, including tackling trade-based money laundering. So this comprehensive approach, which is coordinated at the highest level, the Home Ministry level with Ministry of Defense and all the other stakeholders, Ministry of External Affairs and all the other stakeholders and all the intelligence agencies, including DRI and all. So everybody has to have a common vocabulary, a common operational picture, and do work in their specialized areas, and that's how we'll get over the problem.
Thank you, Colonel. Well, just to say that very warm thanks to all of you. And with this, we are closing our today's excellent debate on global cooperation on anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism. Before closing, I just would like to say that on Saturday, same time from 7 to 9:30, we are going for one more webinar that is on radicalization, violent extremism and terrorism, pre and post COVID. So I would request you all to be there. And thanks to all the viewers, speakers, GCTC members, our moderator and Executive Council member, Kanal Singh sir. Thank you all. Thank you all once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.